Professor Arntzen is Professor Emerita at the University of Toronto. She researches and translates works of pre-modern Japanese literature with these focuses as listed here, and has published a number of translations, including the Kagero Diary and the Sarashina Diary. Her current project is the Igloo and the Crazy Cloud anthology, which will be published next year. Dr. Alan Cummings is Senior Lecturer in Japanese Studies at SOAS in the University of London and Associate Head of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. He translates poetry, and his recent publications included Haiku Love from the British Museum Press and the essay Kagekyo. He also supervised my dissertation when I was studying my undergraduate at the University of London, SOAS. So thank you very much, Dr. Cummings, for coming along. And lastly, the poet and translator Yasuhiro Yotsumoto. He has published since 1991 his collections of poetry and translates as well. And he has contributed to many discussions and roundtables on poetry, including some with the Japan Foundation over the summer, which is where I first encountered his work. And once again, thank you very much, Yotsumoto-san, for joining us so late in Japan. So this is the UK timeline. After this, I will hand over to Professor Arntzen, and then we will have about 20-25 minutes of Q&A at the end, where you will all be invited to ask your questions. But without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Arntzen to take it away.
There you go, the long and the short of it. And next slide, please. Taking the 17th century as haiku's arrival on the Japanese poetry map, there are some 900 years of earlier Japanese poetry for which to account. This presentation's poems will give you a taste of this rich tradition. If no bibliographical information is given on the slide, it means that it's my own unpublished translation. Next. Here is our itinerary for the journey. We'll see experimentation in verse forms in the early period, including long poems. Then comes the period when poetry written in Chinese dominated, a subject we can only mention in passing this time. In the classical period, the preeminent form became the Waka, modern name Tanka, a 31-syllable form divided into syllable count line lengths of 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. In one way of looking at it, Japanese poetry seems to have progressively shortened, culminating in haiku, one of the shortest forms of poetry in the world. On the other hand, one of the reasons that waka, despite its brevity, could remain sufficient as a poetic medium for many centuries was its embedding in prose texts, such as tales and diaries. The titles given here are examples that will be shown. Moreover, in the medieval period, longer poetic forms did develop, such as medieval chanted tales and no drama, along with the collaborative form of poetry composition called Renga, linked verse. Note that in this chronology, the medieval period overlaps with the classical period, which is different from what you would see in a chronology of political history. Next. Here are threads of continuity for you to observe in the examples, and I'll point out when I can. Poetry is dialogue, sometimes is trilogue, vibrant women's voices, psychological acuity, a predilection for natural imagery, and a cinematic sense long before cinema was invented. The Manyoshu was the first private attempt to collect poetry in the native language. The anthology is attributed to Otomo no Yakamochi, mainly because his poems are the most numerous. But it was likely a project handed down through a couple of generations. It contains much poetry of the 600s. One of the geniuses of that period was Kakimoto no Hitomaro, who came to be regarded as a god of poetry in later ages. One senses in the collection's scale and comprehensiveness a fervent desire among the compilers not to let verse in the native language be forgotten in an age when only Chinese verse had prestige. One must remember that Japan had no writing system before contact with Chinese culture, and it took a couple of centuries to develop an independent system of writing for the native language. That is why this manuscript looks like Chinese, but it transcribes Japanese in a vexingly complex way. Once a more efficient phonetic system was developed, the ability to read this older one declined, contributing to the loss to common knowledge of much of the poetry in the Manyoshu. Yeah, next one. Here's our first poem from the Manyoshu, a woman's voice and a dialogue poem. Although it is a 5-line verse, the syllable counts for the lines show that it does not follow Waka's set pattern of 5-7-5-7-7. This poem is one of 4 poems answering 3 poems by a man making excuses for not visiting. I should explain that marriages in the early period and through much of the classical period were visiting arrangements. The woman had her own house and the husband visited. There are a lot of poems by women about waiting, and this is one of them. Now, because I've put the Romanization on this slide, I'm only going to read the Romanized text, and so you can read the English while I read the Japanese. Kom to you mo, kono toki aru wo, koji to you wo, kom to wa mataji, koji to you mono o. The woman's observation of her own mind in this poem, I find remarkable. And although the language of this poem is colloquial and repetitive, the effect and the affect are complex and subtle. Next. This beach scene introduces Achoka, a long poem by Hitomaro, the 7th century genius I mentioned a moment ago. Just for a second, imagine that you've been caught in an open boat at sea and forced ashore on a beach like this, where you encounter a drowned man, and you want to write a poem about it. I wonder if your poem would start the same way as this one by Hitomaro. The land of Sanuki, of the jeweled seaweed, by its very nature, untiring to the eye, its gods by their very nature, mightily sacred, known through ages as the face of a god, ever more pleasing in earth and heaven with the passing days. There in Naka's Bay, we set our ship and came rowing. When a sudden tide wind blew from the heavens, we looked to seaward, where the curled waves rose high. We looked to shoreward, where the white waves clamored, and bent our hurrying oars almost to breaking, in awe of the whale-rich sea. Next one. Of all the many scattered islands, most finely named, Isle of Samine, there on its wild shore we built our shelter, and I saw where you lay, tumbled on that rough bed, the wave loud, clamorous shore spread for pillow. If I knew your home, I would go there and tell them. If your wife but knew, she would come here seeking. She will not know even the lance straight way to take, but waits in trembling yearning, your beloved wife. Now, if you just go back, I reformatted this poem. It's a new translation by Meredith McKinney to show what I see as the cinematic nature of the imagery in it. If you imagine a long pan of the for the opening section, then cut to the boat with the men straining at their oars. And next one. Then pulling the boat ashore. Oops, no, back one. Pulling the boat ashore, and the camera angle shifting to the viewpoint of the narrator and the man's head on the shore. Then flash forward, imagined scene of his home. You get the idea. Now, this long poem is accompanied by two waka, the classical form of the next age, and I've provided one of them here. There are syllable counts at the ends of the lines so that you can see it fits the classical pattern. And I'll read it again in Japanese while you read the English. Tsumamo araba, tsumite tagemashi, sami no yama, nonoe no uagi, sugi ni ikerazu ya. This shows that the waka form was already set by the time of the Manyoshu. However, in the prose introduction, it is called tanka. I mentioned that tanka is the modern name for the waka form, but actually it's also the oldest name. There's a quality of dialogue to both the long poem and the tanka in that they are addressed to the dead man. The combined feelings of awe in the face of nature and empathy for the fragility of human life that infuse this poem are characteristic of much of the poetry of the Manyoshu. Next, please. Now for the golden age of waka. The main meaning of waka is Japanese poetry, to distinguish it from poetry in Chinese. The other name for the form, tanka, short poem, distinguishes it from the long poems in the Manyoshu. The first imperial anthology of waka, the Kokinshu, was a declaration that Japanese poetry in the waka form was now considered the equal of Chinese verse. In all, 21 of these imperial anthologies were produced. The Kokinshu and the Shin-Kokinshu are the two most important of all the anthologies. The similarity of the three titles here tells you at a glance that this was essentially a conservative tradition. Innovation had to be achieved in subtle ways. Next, please. The Kokinshu set the pattern for the organization of all the following anthologies, even though the number of books and the topics of the various books varied some. The precedent of the Kokinshu to devote the majority of space to poems of the seasons, 6 as you see here, and love, 5, was also followed. Next, please. These two poems must stand for the entire Kokinshu. The first one is by one of the compilers, Kino Tsurayuki. And again, because I provided the romanization, I'll read these two poems in Japanese. So the one by Kino Tsurayuki. Sakurabana, chirinuru kaze no nagori ni wa, mizunaki sora ni namizo tachikeru. And I particularly love this translation by Laura Rod, so I'll read it too. The lovely petals, stripped from all the branches still, undulate in the sky. Waterless waves cross the heavens, keepsakes of the wind. Tsurayuki was a master of musicality in this form. Now, another vibrant voice, Lady Ise. Watatsumi to arinishi toko o imasara ni harawa ba sodeya awa to ukinan. Bedding, roughly tossed and tousled as white caps on the broad sea. If now I try to brush it smooth, will my sleeve float like fragile foam? An erotic haze emanates from this bedchamber scene. Think how extremely rare it is in the history of world poetry until the modern era for a free expression of desire on the part of a woman. Next. This 14th century painting introduces sabi, the new darker aesthetic of medieval poetry and art that is quintessential to the Shin-Kokinshu. In the second book of autumn, the compiler Fujiwara no Teika grouped 3 poems that amount to a manifesto of sabi, a manifesto expressed in images and ambiguous emotional resonances rather than theoretical statements. The first 2 poems are by famous monks, Jakuren and Saigyo. Teika himself anchors the sequence. And from here on, I'll read them in English translation only. Sadness does not lie in any one color. No form evokes sorrow. Mountains where tall cypress stand on an evening in autumn. Even a body which has rejected matters of the heart feels pangs of melancholy. Snipe rise from the marsh, evening in autumn. As I gaze afar, I see neither bright flowers nor autumn-colored leaves. A reed-thatched cottage by the bay, evening in autumn. Next one. Waka, as I mentioned, were also embedded in prose narratives. Here's an example from the Ise Tales. The poster from our session depicts this episode. Here's another illustration of the same scene where the poet Ariwara no Narihira meets an ascetic on a mountain path as he's going past Mount Utsu. Next one, please. On and on they went until they reached Suruga province and came to Mount Utsu. The path across it was very dark and narrow, overgrown with ivy and maples, and they were feeling very depressed about their situation when they met an ascetic. "What are you doing here on a path like this?" he asked. The man recognized him. He wrote a letter for the ascetic to take to his love in the capital. Where in Suruga rise the flanks of Mount Utsu, neither the senses nor dreams ever gladden me with the presence of my love. In the Ise Tales, the prose serves mainly as a setting for the poems. Next. Waka also were an integral part of diary literature. In fact, diaries grew out of the custom of keeping personal collections of poetry. One of the special features of Japanese literature is the recognition of diaries as serious literature from an early period. I'm going to show you an example from the 10th century Kagero diary by a woman known as Michitsuna's mother. All but one of the most prominent diaries of the classical period were written by women. The Kagero diary author focuses her life story on her relationship with her husband. One day, when we were passing a quiet time together, we began to argue over a trifle and ended up, both he and I, saying nasty things to one another. He had a fit of anger and left. Thus, as many as 5 or 6 days passed without a word from him. He'd never done anything like this before. It seemed crazy, and here I was thinking it was a kind of joke. But as our relationship was such a fragile thing, it could actually end just like this, I thought. Brooding despondently, I happened to notice the basin of water he had used for dressing his hair the day he'd left. There it was, just as it had been. There was dust on it. Has it come to this? Startled, I wrote. Is this the end? I would ask your reflection if it were there, but on the water left behind as a memento, a film has formed. And now for something quite different. Although Waka dominated official poetry up to the 15th century, in the 13th century, popular forms of chanted narrative began to appear, largely to tell the stories of the wars that usher in the medieval period. The most famous one is the tale of the Heike, the text that evolved from the oral art, mixes prose and poetic passages that tend to the 5/7/5 rhythm. Most translations of the Heike are all in prose, but the formatting of this recent one by Royal Tyler reveals the difference in mode. And I can only read this partially. At Miedera, everyone knows me, the practitioner among Tsutsui no Jo-myo Meishu, a man stalwart against 1,000. Any of you with a stomach for it, come and fight me, see how you do. Those arrows of his in rapid succession he set to the string and let fly. 12 men within bowshot died, 11 were wounded. In his quiver, only one last arrow remained. With a clatter, he dropped the bow, untied the quiver, let it fall, kicked off his fur boots and barefoot, darted across the bridge on a beam. Nobody else dared to follow down this, to him, broad avenue. Just a taste of this epic genre. Okay. Another new poetic form developed for no drama that also mixed dialogue, prose, and extended passages of poetic intensity in the time-honored 5/7/5 rhythm. Here's an example from the play Igloo, which was based on an exchange of Waka between the monk Saigyo, he of the snipe rising into the autumn evening, and the courtesan Eguchi, who would be dancing while you hear these words chanted by the chorus. Spring morning scarlet blossoms adorn the mountain, only to be seduced by the evening wind. Autumn evening of maple leaves, a forest dyed golden, full flushed with color, fades in the morning frost. Wind in the pines, moon through the vines, you exchange vows with the guest, he leaves and never returns. Behind curtains of kingfisher blue, in the scarlet painted chamber, husband and wife place pillows side by side, yet how long before they are parted. Neither senseless grass nor trees, nor human beings who feel, escape the sorrow that must be escaped. I see an equivalent of the cinematic technique of film dissolve in this passage. As I say, long before cinema was invented. Next, please. Finally, we have Renga, linked verse that reached its vogue during the 14th and 15th centuries. Renga is the ancestor for haiku. It was a collaborative form of verse. Typically, 3 poets would create in a single session a poem of 100 verses according to an elaborate set of rules, which made it a game as well as a poetic pursuit. The rules ensured that the sequence would be dominated by natural imagery, but always changed topic to avoid the development of a continuous narrative. The attention was always on the moment of linking. So, here's the opening verse, the hokku, for the 3 poets at Yuyama. With thin snow, color of the red leaves deepens. Ah, this mountain path. Can you go back just a second? I just wanted to point out that the rules dominating, or the rules that controlled the hokku were that it must be set in the season of the session itself, be complete on its own, and have a cutting word, which in this translation is rendered by the ah. And these, of course, are the conventions of haiku. So this is where it is the ancestor. Next one. Now the next poet gives 2 lines that will complete the poem. So I'm going to read them, the first one and the second one together, because they were considered a complete poem. With thin snow, color of the red leaves deepens. Ah, this mountain path. At the cliff foot, pampas plumes, even in winter, still worth seeing. Next one. Next poet gives 3 lines again, but again, the 2 should form a complete poem on their own. At the cliff foot, pampas plumes, even in winter, still worth seeing. I was first seduced to set out from my lodging by the pine crickets. Pine crickets are a phenomena of autumn. So Sogi has brought in another season into a winter poem. Let's see what happens next. I was first seduced to set out from my lodging by the pine crickets. How deep the night has become, autumn wind in my sleeves. Now we're firmly in autumn, and we're listening to the pine crickets. Next. With this image of autumn leaves, we're going to leave the Renga, and I'm going to leave you. And I hope you've enjoyed this whirlwind tour through 900 years of poetry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arntzen. And sorry, you had the daunting task of doing almost a millennium of different poetry to get through there. So that was incredibly interesting. I'm now going to ask to hand over to Dr. Alan Cummings.
Thank you, Edmund, and thank you, Sonja. just cheer that up. So I've been given an interesting road to hoe today, which is to talk about Tokugawa period poetry that wasn't haikai or haiku, as we more commonly call it today. This is a little tricky, as the 17-syllable haiku form was, of course, the type of poetry that we associate most strongly with the Tokugawa period. Beginning with the comic and often ribald linked verse Renga at the start of the period, and then undergoing an elevation by poets such as Basho in the late 17th century. The shofu style developed by Basho and his followers would slowly ripple out almost across the entire country of Japan, and it continues to be probably the most widely composed form of poetry in Japan today. But given that vitality, given that geographical spread, and given the influence that the haiku approach to poetics had on other forms, haiku is really, really difficult to avoid when talking about Tokugawa period poetry. But that said, I'll try to do my best to steer us down some lesser trodden byways. Like Sonja, I will have nothing to say about poetry in Chinese today, though there was a vast amount of it that was composed during the Tokugawa period as well. And instead, I'll focus on Japanese poetry, beginning by talking about what happens to Waka in this period as Waka continues to be composed. And then I'll move on to say a few things about a couple of more consciously humorous forms. Kyoka, which is a comic version of Waka, and Senryu, which is a comic version of haiku. Some of us, I'm sure, may remember Donald Keene's fairly broad dismissal of Tokugawa period waka in his monumental history of Edo period literature, World Within Walls. He writes about it as being mostly, quote, undistinguished, despite the care, scholarship, and intelligence everywhere apparent. Careful but uninspired and uninspiring. There has been some chipping away at that idea over the 40-odd years since Keene wrote it. And now we have a slightly more nuanced view of some of the vitality of the waka form in this period as it begins to push up against the boundaries that have been set up around it by the court aristocrats who had continued to act as instructors, guardians of the tradition, and arbiters of poetic taste through the Kamakura and Muromachi periods. But as we move into the Tokugawa period at the start of the 17th century, this all begins to change quite markedly, particularly because of literacy. So literacy begins to spread through society, from warriors to merchants, even to farmers in the countryside. And many of these newly literate classes took up the practice of composing waka, sometimes because of their own interest. It's a culturally weighty form. It was something to aspire to, but it was also kind of socially and culturally useful as well. Poetry circles created very useful cross-status social and cultural venues in Japanese towns and cities, where people from different status groups were able to meet and mingle and compose together. This could be useful for business as well as socializing. And all of this means that by the end of the Tokugawa period, far more waka had been composed than had existed in all of the previous periods of Japanese history combined. And with these new demographics of women and merchants and farmers who begin to study and compose poetry, new and distinctive voices begin to emerge that really challenge the existing aristocratic color and identity of waka. The styles of Tokugawa waka were broader than in previous periods, both because of the new voices of these poets from new status groups, but also because of a couple of other changes and advances. Sonja touched upon the Manyoshu, this first 8th century poetic compendium, and she mentioned that the kind of Japanese that text was written in was a proto-form of written Japanese that later became very, very difficult to understand. But as we come into the Into the 18th century, Kokugaku nativist scholars like Kamono Mabuchi and Motori Norinaga, his pupil, begin to do work to shed some light on the meaning of those Manyoshu poems. And people begin to rediscover Manyoshu poetry in the Tokugawa period. So this rediscovery of that poetry from a period before poetry became dominated by the court had an invigorating effect upon many Tokugawa poets, including figures like the Zen monk Ryokan and Tachibana Akemi. I guess this is probably easiest to show you an example. Let's see if we can do that. So here's one example of a poem by Tachibana Akemi, who was active in the 19th century. And this is one poem from an 11 stanza sequence that he writes about silver mining. Akemi was the heir to a paper and ink business in Fukui, but at the age of 28, he hands that business over to his younger brother so he can concentrate on writing poetry full time, which is what he does for the rest of his life, living in a kind of genteel poverty. But here he is. You see him writing about the physical labor at a silver mine. Let me just, I'll read the poem in Japanese. Mahadaka no onoko muri ite akagane no marogare kataku tsuyuchi furite. Stark naked men gather in groups and wielding hammers smash into pieces great lumps of unwrought metal. It's a topic. I think you can sense the physicality and force in that poem that would have been very, very alien to the Heian imperial court tradition. You can't really imagine Heian aristocrats wielding hammers and smashing rocks, but here we have that kind of topic reappearing in poetry in the Tokugawa period in the 19th century. The growth and popularity of haiku, as I say, we can never quite get away from haiku, but the growth and popularity of haiku, it also begins to have an influence on waka in this period. Many of those newly literate poets were also familiar with haiku composition. So one notable characteristic of Tokugawa period waka is that we begin to see elements that bleed across from haiku poetics into waka. Sometimes there will be direct quotation or reference to famous haiku poems, but the influence could be equally subtle and a little harder to trace. Roger Thomas, for example, has written about examples of synesthesia in Tokugawa period waka, which very much seem to owe their blending of the senses to haiku, rather than anything that appeared previously in the waka tradition. Haiku creeps into waka practice in other sorts of ways too, particularly in the favorite practice of drawing startling comparisons between the refined aristocratic pastimes of former eras and the more quotidian lives of Tokugawa period merchants and peasants. Take a look, for example, at this verse by the nun Otagaki Rengetsu. Rengetsu has one of these kind of archetypal tough female lives of the Tokugawa period. She had 2 children from a first marriage that ended in divorce. Both of those children died very young. She then married again, giving birth to a daughter, only to have both husband and daughter die within 2 years of each other. She then decides to make the decision to become a nun, as you might, having lost 3 children and 2 husbands at the age of 33. And she later supports herself by writing pottery, which is inscribed with her own poetry. And here's one of her very distinctive poems. Fuyubata no one no kuki ni shimo saete asato de samushi okazaki no sato. Frost glistens on daikon stalks in winter fields. Cold the morning departure in Okazaki village. I think the key word in this poem is that asatode. It's been translated just as the morning departure, but this is a phrase from classical Waka, where it would refer to a courtier tearfully leaving his lover at dawn, creeping away from her rooms. But here, in a very Heike-like and humorous twist, Rengetsu translates and relocates that departure away from the capital and into a rustic village in the middle of winter. We also have quite haiku-like focuses upon the pleasures of intimacy and family in Tokugawa period Waka. See, for example, this one here, which is by a poet called Okuma Kotochi. Kotochi was the son of a pawn shop owner, and he's also one of the most prolific Waka poets of the Tokugawa period. He argues that poetic style needs to be true to the spirit of the age that the poet lives in, rather than attempting to imitate the ancients. And this is one of the kind of the constant debates in Waka theory, which is how much should you depend upon the past, either in terms of spirit or language or diction. And here he presents this quite beautiful image of a mother and child. Imo ga sei ni neburu warawa no utsunaki te ni saimeguru kazaguruma kana. A child fast asleep on a young mother's back, in its hand grasped unconsciously a pinwheel is spinning. I think with that beautiful image, I'll step aside from Waka and come to the comic verse forms of Kyoka and Senryu. The easiest way to think about both of these two poetic genres is to imagine that they are the comic mirror images of Waka and Haiku respectively. Instead of the variations on the conventional imagery and emotional situations of those two canonical forms, instead you get a focus upon the non-traditional and the incongruous. Instead of the elegant diction and sophisticated prosody, we find wit, satire, delightful off-the-cuff improvisations, and sometimes quite ribald or erotic humor. To summarize the feel of Kyoka, which is the comic form of Waka, the Japanese scholar Hamada Giichiro has invoked the apt image of a poet who, quote, wears a robe made of silk brocade tied up with a sash made out of straw. So that contrast between the silk and the straw, that back and forth between those two quite different things. Kyoka means literally mad verse, and it had been composed from the medieval period, but it doesn't really become established as an art form in its own right until we get into Tokugawa. It emerges first in Kyoto and Osaka, and then takes off in Edo in the 1770s and 1780s, led by some young retainers to the Bakufu, including Yomono Akara, Akira Kanko, and Karagoromo Kishu. Kyoka can be quite dizzying in their variety of techniques and construction of meaning. And I'll give you just 3 examples to show you what I mean. So the first is by Yomono Akara. That was the pen name of the Sharebon and Kibyoshi novelist Oda Nampo, a kind of a really big figure in literary circles in the 18th century, start of the 19th century. And his poem we have here. So Yoshiwara no yomise oharu no yugure wa iri ai no kane ni hanaya sakuran. In Yoshiwara, the women are displaying their wares as evening falls, blossoms glowing amidst the echoes of the Vesper bells. It's basically a poem of 2 contrasting halves. The first half with that image of the sex workers of Yoshiwara, the Edo pleasure quarters, uses contemporary imagery and diction Whereas the last three lines, the evening, vesper bells, the flowers, all of that could have appeared verbatim in a Heian or Kamakura imperial anthology. So the effect here lies in that conjunction of treating a classical topic or a contemporary topic using classical language or vernacular language. You get this kind of back and forth between those two different worlds. And the Tokugawa poets seem to have sensed some sort of humor in that back and forth between those two very different universes. You get a lot of kyoka whose effect rests upon bringing classicism into a contemporary domestic setting. Like this one here by Karagoromo Kishu. Suzushisa wa atarashi tatami aosudare tsumago no rusu ni hitori mikazuki. The coolness of brand new tatami mats and of fresh bamboo blinds, of gazing at the new moon while the wife and kids are out. Enjoying the cool is very much a classical topic for a poem, and gazing at the moon of the third night and the blinds are also rich with classical nuance. What is not, of course, are new tatami mats. That's not something that aristocrats would ever have written about. Those kind of green tinged, very fresh scented tatami, if you've ever seen those. And then in this final twist towards domesticity, we get the idea that the only time a man can truly relax and enjoy the moon is when his wife and kids are absent for the day. Some kyoka, the humor is a little more surreal than that. One particular favorite of mine is this one by the monk Ryokan. Karigamo wa ware o misete sari ni keri, tofu ni hane no naki zo ureshiki. The geese and ducks abandon me and leave. Thank goodness that my tofu at least does not boast wings. The point here is actually a classical reference. Geese and ducks are supposed to be lacking in feeling and emotion since they fly away in spring, just as the cherry blossoms are beginning to come into bloom. But the delightful idea of winged tofu is very much that of ryokan. There's something quite startlingly modern and surreal about that idea. And that brings us finally to Senryu, the 17th syllable comic version of haiku. They have the same 5-7-5 structure, but instead of focusing upon the natural world, they look instead at human relationships and the contemporary, often using biting satire or stereotypes, sarcasm, other types of humor. Frequently seen figures in Senryu include the avaricious samurai, the hapless cuckold, the lecherous priest, the crabby and resentful mother-in-law, and the spendthrift son. The requirement for a seasonal word and a cutting word, the kigo and the kireji of haiku, are both jettisoned, and the topics become much broader. We have domestic life, we have the world of work, we have the relations between the sexes, we have the licensed quarters, of course, recent scandals, all sorts of things appear in Senryu. Most Senryu are written under pseudonyms, so we have very little idea about who wrote any of these things. And many of them are also submitted as part of public competitions, where somebody would suggest a topic and people would send in verses. There's also a deep trove of Senryu that are entirely and unashamedly pornographic, but I'm not going to show you any of those today. If anybody's interested, let me know. I know we're running out of time here, so I will just end by sharing a few favorites. Nyobo ga rusude ichinichi sagashigoto. His wife away, he spends the whole day searching for things. Soiji shite tana ni iwashi ga gozariyasu. Baby at her breast, she tells him there's sardines on the shelf. Ari hitotsu teijo shitaobi made hodoki. A single ant and the young miss is down to her underclothes. He o hite okashiku mo nai hitorimono. – Laying a fart, no humor in it when you live alone. And my two final ones. Waraigao made keisei wa koshiraeru. Even her smile is carefully made up, the courtesan. Ko fuko futatsu naraberu nurimakura. A filial daughter and an unfilial son sleeping side by side. I think that last one probably needs an academic footnote, which is that filial daughters would often sell themselves into licensed prostitution for a number of years in order to support their families, hence them being filial. Unfilial sons will, of course, go and waste their family's money in the pleasure quarters, hence them lying side by side. Thank you. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Yotsumoto-san.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Cummings. Some very nice and refreshingly direct poems there after the kind of more classical stuff. So now if we hand over to Yotsumoto-san to take us into the modern period.
Well, thank you, Sonia and Alan. I have learned already so much. Now, please, Edmund, can you turn on the first slide? So I'm going to summarize the birth and the development of the modern Japanese poetry. Is it coming up? There you go. And I call this a journey to Jiyushi. Jiyu is freedom or liberty, and shi is poetry. So it basically means a journey to free poetry. It's a long journey, and I'm one of those who is still following it. And I use this term, jiyushi, or free poetry, in two senses. One is a poem written by a free spirit, and a poem written in freestyle. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's all started around the mid-19th century when the black ship came from America to the coast near Yokohama, and Admiral Perry forced Japan to open its door to the rest of the world. Japan did so for the first time in 200 years. New thoughts, knowledges, and technologies poured in from the Western civilization, and Japan went through a dramatic revolution in all aspects of their lives: politics, social structure, military, economy, art, and science, and of course, poetry. It was a completely new world, and people wanted to have a new voice to express it. On the right-hand side of this slide, I show the first anthology called Shintai Shisho, literally translated as New Body Poetry Anthology, which was published in 1882, Meiji 15年. Next slide, please. But creating a new body of poetry was not an easy task for the Japanese. It was a challenge in two ways. For one, it's a vertical line of this matrix. We had to find a way to write a poem in freestyle as opposed to the fixed syllable style, such as tanka or haiku or sendu or renga that we have just learned. For another, on the horizontal one, we had to find a way to write as we speak, which was more challenging because the Japanese language used to be quite different between writing and speaking up to this point of the history. Next slide, please. Now, speaking of this first challenge from fixed to free, it was technically not so difficult thanks to a long tradition of writing Chinese style poetry in Japan. In fact, up to Meiji Revolution, when you say shi, poem, it meant kanshi, Chinese style poem. And some poets started to write freestyle poems, but in the written Japanese, already during the Edo era. More important here is the pursuit of freedom in the political and human rights areas. The Japanese people were so excited to learn that all people were made equally, could speak out whatever they think or believe, and could love and marry any man or woman you choose, all of which had been unthinkable under the feudalistic society. Many young poets in this period were engaged both in the civil rights movement and the free romantic love. Next slide, please. The second challenge of getting free from spoken language and mastering to write as you speak, and that is called Genbun Ichi Undo, roughly translated as vernacular movement or reform movement. And it was much more difficult. It took 25 years since the publication of a new body poetry anthology for the first spoken language poem to be written. Kawaji Ryuko, he was then just 19 years old, wrote a poem called Hakidame, describing a garbage dump site at the back of a restaurant in the spoken Japanese, and made a history, and also caused a great sensation, or the most of which was quite unfavorable. Then it took another 10 years before Hagiwara Sakutaro, who is often called as father of the modern Japanese poetry, established a solid base of spoken Japanese writing style in poetry. And in the process, translation played a significant role. And I'm showing two cases in here. On the right-hand side is the one of the very popular anthology of translation poetry, such as Wordsworth and Keats. But also on the left-hand side, the translation of Christian Bible and hymns helped Japanese to learn how to write as you speak. Next slide, please. So here, let me introduce two poems that illustrate the free spirit of the age and their struggle to express it in freely in their own language. Those poems were written by a wife and a husband, Yosano, Akiko, and Tekkan. The first poem I introduce is Akiko's, the wife's one, which she wrote in 1904, right in the middle of the Japan-Russia war. Her younger brother was drafted and sent to the most fiercely fought battlefield in the northern China as a foot soldier. And this is what she had to say. Next slide, please. I read it in Japanese. Kimi, 死にたもうことなかれ。旅順港包囲軍の中にある弟を嘆きて。ああ、弟よ、君を泣く。気に死にたもうことなかれ。末に生まれし君なれば。親の情けは勝りしも。親は刃を握らせて、人を殺せと教えしや。人を殺して死ねよとて。24まで育てしや。堺の町の空き人の旧家を誇る主にて、親の名を継ぐ君なれば、気に死にたもうことなかれ。旅順の城は滅ぶとも、滅びずとても何事ぞ。君は白地の空き人の 家の掟になかりけり。君死にたもうことなかれ。すめらみことは戦いに、王自らは入れまさね。片身に人の血を流し、獣の道に死ねよとは、死ぬるお人の誉れとは、王御心の深ければ、元より以下でおぼされん。ああ、弟よ。戦いに君死にたもうことなかれ。すぐにし秋を父君に、遅れたまえる母君は、嘆きの中に痛ましく、我が子を召され家を盛り、安しと聞ける大名も、母の白髪は勝りぬる。のれんの影に伏してなく、あえかに若き新妻を、君忘るるや思えるや、とつきのそわで別れたる乙女心を思いみよ。この世一人の君ならで、ああ、また誰を頼むべき。君、死にたもうことなかれ。Akiko was a woman of free spirit and extreme vitality, giving birth to 12 children and countless tanka, poem, essays, and modern Japanese translation of Tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, in many different versions. Still, it is surprising to witness her speaking out so honestly and fiercely against the war and the emperor behind it, especially when the Japanese public in general supported the war in a nationalistic sentiment and worshipped emperor as a living god. But as for this writing style, this is, while this is definitely not a tanka or haiku, but not completely free either. It's somewhere in between. I guess you heard this 7-5 syllable rhythm, and also the language is more in written style than spoken. Now compare this to a poem written 6 years later in 1910 by her husband, Tekkan. Next, please. He wrote this poem in the wake of the so-called Taigyaku Jiken, or high treason incident, in which several hundred socialists and anarchists were arrested, 24 of them executed under the ungrounded allegation of an attempted assassination of emperor. Among 24 executed was Oishi Seinosuke, a 43-year-old medical doctor and a close friend of Tekkan. And here's what he wrote about it. Seinosuke no shi. 大石清之助は死にました。いい君な、機械に挟まれて死にました。人の名前に清之助はたくさんある。しかし、私の友達の清之助はただ一人。私はもうその清之助に会われない。なんの、構うもんか。機械に挟まれて死ぬような、バカな、大バカな、私の一人の友達の清之助。それでも清之助は死にました。おう、死にました。日本人でなかった清之助。立派な気違いの清之助。あることかないことか。神様を最初に無視した清之助。大学無道の清之助。本にまあ、皆さんいい君な。その清之助は死にました。清之助と清之助の一味が死んだので、忠良な日本人はこれから気楽に寝られます。おめでとう。Now, those two poems were both translated by Janine Beichman. And this poem of Tekkan, the husband, is equally bold and courageous as Akiko, although his tone is more ironic and sarcastic. And here he's referring to God, that Seinosuke, the ignore our imperial God, of course, refers to the emperor, and he could himself be put into jail for this. Now, as for the styles of writing, it is quite in contrast with Akiko's poem written just 6 years ago. Tekkan is totally free from 7-5 syllable, and the language is colloquial, almost the same as we speak it today. In fact, this poem could pass as a contemporary Japanese poem with minimum modification. Next slide, please. In 1912, Meiji Emperor died, and a new era of Taisho started. And it was a brief moment of liberal toleration called Taisho democracy. And now that the Japanese poets achieved Genbun Ichi, that is how to write as you speak, they seek even more radical ways of writing by learning modernism, Dadaism, surrealism, symbolism, you name it, almost in real time from Europe and the United States. It was a celebration of freedom in writing, jiu. Let's take a look at one of them, this poem written by Sagawa Chika. Next slide. 昆虫が電流のような速度で繁殖した。近くの腫れ物を舐め尽くした。美麗な衣装を裏返して都会の夜は女のように眠った。私は今殻を干す。鱗のような皮膚は金属のように冷たいのである。顔半面を塗りつぶしたこの秘密を誰も知ってはいないのだ。夜は盗まれた表情を自由に回転さすあざのある女を有頂天にする。It is amazing that a young woman was writing such a avant-garde poem in the early 1930s in the northern Hokkaido island, so far away from Tokyo. Next slide, please. Another example of jiushi, or free poem, from this period is Yagi Jukichi, this young man on the right. He's a Christian poet, a rare but definitely surviving breed of poets in this country. And his poems are so short that I can read a few of them. Next, please. The first poem, a plain koto, 素朴なkoto. Koto is a Japanese musical instrument similar to a zither with 13 strings. この明るさの中へ一つの素朴なkotoを置けば秋の美しさに耐えかねkotoは静かに鳴り出すだろう。細いガラス。細いガラスがピーンと割れました。The third poem. 鉛と蝶々。鉛の中を蝶々が飛んでゆく。The last two poems are as short as haiku, but the language is definitely freestyle and spoken language. Yagi Jukichi died at the age of 29 and Chika at 25, but they were lucky enough to have been recognized and their poems survives to this day. Many young poets of their contemporary were not so lucky. They were buried deep in history and quickly and oftentimes totally forgotten, partly because of the World War II and the violent oppression by the fascist government. Next slide, please. By the time Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor, the freestyle poetry in Japan was almost completely silenced. Established poets, including many former modernists and proletariat poets, voluntarily let go of the freestyle spoken language poetry and wrote a huge number of the war-praising poems in the traditional written language style. And this image of the slide is one of the many poetry anthologies, and it's called Tsuji Shishu, of such a war-praising poems. And those who contributed to these anthologies and supported the military dictatorship have erased the fact from their record after the war. So it's not widely known today. Those who did not take part in it were either tortured or went underground and wrote protest poems in isolation. It was a dark moment of free poetry or jiyushi. Next, in the last slide, please. The post-war Japanese poetry started from the ruin of the once prospered free poetry, jiyushi, with a sense of shame and guilt. It was the survivors' guilt towards the war victims and the shame of surrendering their free poetry, the precious achievement after decades of trial and error in the face of the dictatorship. The journey has resumed only slowly and painstakingly. The recovery process is still ongoing today. Now let me finish my talk by presenting a poem by one of the best-known poets of our time, Shuntaro Tanikawa. If you can go back to this slide, I just want to show. So here is Shuntaro as a boy playing with the model plane. And here's Shuntaro at the corner on the left side with this model plane, which is my birthday gift to him because he's celebrating 19 years birthday this month. Next to him is William Eliot, who translates the poem that I'm going to read now. He's also 90 years old. He spent his lifetime to translate every single poem that Shuntaro wrote. And Shuntaro is probably the best known poet today in Japan, but he's also the translator of Charles Brown's series. And he wrote a lyric of the theme song of Tetsuan Atom, or Atomic Boy, a hero, when I was a young boy. So next, please. 芝生。そして私はいつかどこかから来て、不意にこの芝生の上に立っていた。なすべきことはすべて私の細胞が記憶していた。だから私は人間の形をし、幸せについて語りさえしたのだ。Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yotsumoto-san. That was fantastic look at modern poetry. And I was really interested by what you said at the end there about the relinquishing maybe of the freestyle poetry in the pre-war period and the war from under pressure by the Japanese government. And I think I remember even reading that the poet Yasuhiro Yotsumoto even she made a slight turn to supporting the war and the regime, which is kind of a fascinating shift, given that the thought of that early poem, "Thou shalt not die." So it must be an incredibly difficult situation for all those people, and as you say, it's still kind of recovering today, the poetry scene perhaps. So we're now going to move to the Q&A. So if anybody would like to raise their hand and ask a question, I wonder if I could just kick things off by picking up on a theme that Alan mentioned, which is talking about maybe a sort of social issue or a class issue with the early tanka. They're quite aristocratic, and they were the product of a very socially small circle, the court in the capital Heian-kyo, which is modern day Kyoto. But I know that at the same time, especially in some of the early anthologies, Professor Arntzen will be able to correct me on this, but there were inclusions from figures such as border guards and more marginal figures from society. And I think as well in the Kojiki, the first collection of Japanese writing, it seems that there were lots of things that were kind of taken from folk songs, maybe. So Professor Arntzen, I was wondering if you could just maybe say a little bit about if there was, perhaps writing from more marginal groups during the pre-Tokugawa period, if you can.
Yes, just as you say, in the Manyoshu, it was very broad, and there were folk songs and border guards. One of the things that struck me, and I loved the circle that was made when Yotsumoto-san's talk, coming back to the development of a free colloquial, a language based on how people speak. And I was glad that I chose, although she's an aristocrat, the first poem about waiting, that's exactly colloquial language. And it wasn't the 575. And so it's as though from the Manyoshu, we came full circle to the modern period, And I was so pleased to see that loop made. It's funny how there's an old Chinese saying, you warm up the old to know the new. And I was also struck, and I had a sort of question to Yotsumoto-san, that the Yosano Akiko's famous poem, the Kimi, Shini Tamo Nakare, Koto Nakare, it's not only sort of 575, but it also has the influence of kanshi. The nakare is kanshi, a language too, is it not?
I think so. The kanshi helps Japanese to speak out, whereas uta, tanka, makes us just lament and say, but when you really want to assert yourself, the kanshi tradition in our body comes out, and and as I said, some poets were using it already during the Edo period, writing rather long, sort of freestyle poems, but in this 5/7 rhythm and the traditional Japanese languages.
I was just going to add to that briefly that we couldn't talk about kanji, but it is so much a part of Japanese poetry.
Absolutely, yes.
And
I think if it were not for kanji, we could not have adapted the Western style literature and poetry so easily at the turn of the Meiji period.
Yes, yes. One of my favorite textbooks of Kambun says that Kambun, Chinese, writing in Chinese, is the furusato, the old hometown of our hearts. And anyhow.
Thank you. That's a very interesting idea, and I think it's interesting as well the way in which the sort of dialogue between Japanese language poetry maybe and kanji, and there's a gendered issue to that, isn't there? Especially with Chinese learning in the classical period, and I think gender is something that keeps on coming up with Japanese poetry. I wonder, maybe Professor Arntzen, could you just say a little bit about the way in which women were influential in the development of kind of Japanese writing and expression during the classical period.
You have a lecture already on that on your website with
We do,
Haiku
yeah.
and Jennifer Guest, and it's such a huge topic. But just briefly, I noticed in the examples that I chose, the women's voices, and actually Yotsumoto-san in one of his online interviews mentioned that the women's voices tend to be very fresh and somehow modern seeming. When you look through the classical period, even the one by Lady Ise about the tousled bed seem quite modern in a way, and that's but we can't get into the long topic of the gendered roles, but there does seem to be a way in which the women are not as inhibited. So I was fascinated again to say that Yosano Akiko was more limited in her first attempt, at least in language-wise, than Tekan. Tekan really broke through in that poem.
Yeah.
I have a question for Alan, just quickly, if we wanted to bring Alan.
Please
Alan
go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, not so much a question, but it was fascinating to me in Kyoka. I thought Kyoka were more like Senryu, but the examples you showed in English translation seem to be closer to Tokugawa Waka in many ways, because the humor is so gentle. And perhaps that's mainly in the translation rather than in the language itself. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, it's Kyoka just feels intensely broad, where you can have some things where you go that doesn't seem to be particularly humorous, to things which are just utterly absurd, and so much of it as well is so difficult to even to try to understand now, because it does seem to be so kind of, a lot of Kyoka is kind of composed in those kind of communal situations as well. So you have lots of those things in kind of prints and paintings which seem to refer to something that happened at a particular venue, that a particular group of people would have understood what was happening. But to us now, trying to reconstruct what somebody said in their cups at a Tokugawa party 200 years ago is really, really difficult to reconstruct. But yeah, there's definitely a kind of a permeable line, I think, between some of the kind of the more nativist Tokugawa Waka stuff, and like the Tachibana Akemi, the silver mine stuff. There seems to be quite a permeable line between what the definition of Waka is versus what the definition of a Kyoka is. Yeah, but it does feel very, very broad to me. If anybody's interested in kind of reading more about Kyoka, it's one of those things that people really haven't written that much about yet in English. And the really interesting stuff is actually self-published. I mean, do people know this book by Robin Gill, which is a huge 700-page self-published experimental work of translation, where he'll provide 3 or 4 different ways to get at the humor of each poem that he translates. But he's somebody who's dealt with a full range of it, and some of it is just mind-boggling. Some of the things that people were coming up with. But yeah, if anybody's interested in following that further, Robin Gill has a couple of really interesting books.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously humor is one of the difficult things to translate successfully. There's a question from Frederick Padley in the chat saying that another difficulty is or an unsatisfactory aspect of haiku reading in English, and I guess this extends equally to reading waka or many other of the rhythmic based styles, is the absence of the pleasure of rhythm in English in the same way. And I think all 3 of the speakers here have been involved in translation in different ways. And I wonder if you could comment on that, how you try to deal with that problem. Maybe Yotsumoto-san, you could start.
Oh, I'm a contemporary poet, and then I translate mostly the contemporary works, which is very dry. And if you take 5-7 syllables rhythm out of our language, Japanese, the Japanese becomes so flat. And it's very difficult to bring the new music in it, although we all try it. And the and translating that music into English is also, of course, a challenge, but I think it's the kind of a challenge, the difficult challenge that applies to almost any kind of a translation, any language translation.
Yeah, interesting. Professor Arntzen, what would you say about your efforts with conveying rhythm with the things that you've worked with translating?
Yes. Oh, it's the most frustrating thing. One of the reasons why I read Laurel Rod's translation of Kino Tsurayuki's was because I thought that translation in particular, it's not the same rhythm, but it has a beautiful rhythm in English. The 5/7/5 is just like the iambic pentameter. What the 5/7/5 is to Japanese, the iambic pentameter is to English. And every once in a while, I try and work in rhyme because I think rhyme is to English too what the 5/7/5 is to Japanese. The rhyme has never been part of Japanese poetry because it's too easy. Every word ends with one of 5 vowels. So if you concentrated on rhyme, there were some experiments in the modern period. I've seen one by Kato Shuichi, but it never takes off because it's just too easy. Although in the modern language with all the kanji compounds, that makes it more complex. So in that translation from Eguchi, which I had done many, many years ago, when I could change, I had wind in the pines, moon through the ivy. And then I changed it to wind in the pines, moon through the vines. And there was a rhyme between pines and vines. And it was so pleasing. But it's, you know that you always leave so much of the musicality out, but the effort of trying is still always worthwhile.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think every time I've ever read the introduction to translated Japanese poetry, it always talks about how it's essentially a futile exercise. So one sympathizes with the people involved in it. We get drawing towards the end now, but I think there's a question from, is it Jeannie Nakano here, which I just want to bring up, because I think it ties together the whole theme of the webinar quite nicely. The webinar was Japanese poetry beyond haiku, but obviously that's, there's a big hole here, which is haiku, and is of course by far the best known form abroad, and as Alan said, it's also still probably the most practiced today in Japan. I wonder, Alan, if I could just put it to you what Jeannie asks: why is haiku known? Why is it more popular than tanka? Why is it the most popular form?
Surely it has to do with the accessibility. If you think about the classical tradition of waka or tanka, it did require a knowledge of the tradition. Whereas in that sense, haiku is more accessible. Obviously, the more you read, the more you know, the better the poems you'll be able to compose are. But there isn't that same stress upon having to relate what you're writing to something that already exists. And part of the pleasure of the tanka tradition was always, how can you build those links to the poetry of the past. Obviously people still continue to write tanka. There are lots and lots of tanka circles, and there are people who write 20th century, 21st century tanka does not depend upon those same traditions, and you get kind of, if you think about I don't know, Tawaraya Machi or something like that, you know, kind of solid anniversary and those kind of things which kind of talk about, you know, swimsuits and teaching in a classroom and, you know, dates and drinking Coca-Cola, and all those things can also can become tanka as well. You know, the form is the form. But yeah, I think traditionally that accessibility and that lesser demand to have a very high level of education, that was the, you know, the barrier. It was also part of the appeal of Waka as well for so long, you know, making yourself part of that tradition. But yeah, to me it's the accessibility.
Perfect, thank you very much.